The ex-slave Arnold Gragston shares a fascinating account of how he helped hundreds of slaves escape to freedom across the Ohio River while he himself remained enslaved. This makes him one of the rare slave conductors of the Underground Railroad. As he put it, he guessed he could be called a conductor on the Underground Railway, only we didn't call it that then. I didn't know we just called it anything. We just knew there were a lot of slaves always a-wanting to get free, and I had to help them. As is often the case, there are just a few photographs of Arnold Gragston, so we'll use illustrations from Frederick Douglass's slave biography, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and other sources in this reflection. Arnold Gragston begins. Most of the slaves didn't know when they were born, but I did. You see, I was born on a Christmas morning. It was in 1840. I was a full-grown man when I finally got my freedom. Before I got it, though, I helped a lot of others get theirs. Lord knows how many. Might have been as many as 200 to 300. It was way more than 100, I know. But all that came after I was a young man, grown enough to know a pretty girl when I saw one, and to go chasing after her, too. I was born on a plantation that belonged to Mr. Jack Tabb in Mason County, just across the river in Kentucky. Gragston remembers. Mr. Tabb was a pretty good man. He used to beat us, sure, but not nearly so much as others did. Some of his own kin people, even. But he was kind of funny sometimes. He used to have a special slave who didn't have nothing to do but teach the rest of us, and we had about 10 on the plantation, and a lot other on the plantations near us, how to read and write and figure. Now, Mr. Tabb liked us to know how to figure, but sometimes when he would send for us and we would be a long time coming, he would ask us where we had been. If we told him we had been learning to read, he would near beat the daylights out of us after getting somebody to teach us. And I think he did some of that so the other owners wouldn't think he was spoiling his slaves. Arnold's master may have been breaking the law by teaching his slaves how to read. Many states passed laws forbidding masters from teaching their slaves how to read because slave owners were spooked by the brutal Nat Turner slave rebellion in 1831. Which we discussed in our reflection on the 3 generations of leading black leaders. What other famous ex-slave learned how to read? Even as a child, Frederick Douglass was a rebellious slave. When he was leased out to the Aulds in Baltimore, Maryland, Mrs Auld started teaching him how to read, but the lesson stopped when her husband found out. But Douglass had learned enough that he was able to improve his literacy with help from his white playmates. Gragston recalls, Mr. Tabb was funny about marrying us, too. He would let us go a-courting on the other plantations near any time we liked, and if we were good, and if we found somebody we wanted to marry, and she was on a plantation that belonged to one of his kinfolk or a friend, he would swap a slave so that the husband and wife could be together. And sometimes when he couldn't do this, he would let a slave work all day on his plantation and live with his wife at night on her plantation. Some of the other owners was always talking about his spoiling us. Now, Mr. Tabb was especially good to me. He used to let me go all about. I guess he had to. Couldn't get too much work out of me even when he kept me right under his eyes. I learned fast, too, and I think he kind of liked that. He used to call Dandy Davis, the slave who taught me, the smartest nigger in Kentucky. And Gragston remembers. It was 'cause Mr. Tabb used to let me go round in the day and night so much that I came to be the one who carried the runaway slaves over the river. It was funny the way I started it, too. I didn't have no idea of ever getting mixed up in any sort of business like that until one special night. I hadn't even thought of rowing across the river myself. But one night I had gone on another plantation a-courting, and the old woman whose house I went to told me she had a pretty girl there who wanted to go across the river, and would I take her? I was scared and backed out in a hurry. But then I saw the girl, and saw she was such a pretty little thing, brown skin and kind of rosy, and looking as scared as I was feeling, so it wasn't long before I was listening to the old woman tell me when to take her and where to leave her on the other side. I didn't have nerve enough to do it that night, though, so I told him to wait until tomorrow night. All the next day I kept seeing Mr. Tabb laying a rawhide across my back, or shooting me, and kept seeing that scared little brown girl back at the house, looking at me with her big eyes and asking me if I wouldn't just row her across to Ripley. Me and Mr. Tabb lost, and soon as the dust settled that night, I was at the old lady's house. I don't know how I ever rowed the boat across the river. The current was strong and I was trembling. I couldn't see a thing there in the dark, but I felt that girl's eyes. We didn't dare to whisper, so I couldn't tell her how sure I was that Mr. Tabb or some of the other owners would tear me up when they found out what I had done. I just knew they would find out. Now, I was worried, too, about where to put her out of that boat. I couldn't ride her across the river all night, and I didn't know a thing about the other side. I had heard a lot about it from the other slaves, but I thought it was just about like Mason County, with slaves and masters, overseers and rawhides. And so, I just knew that if I pulled the boat up and went to asking people where to take her, I would get a beating or get killed. Now, I don't know whether it seemed like a long time or a short time now. It's so long ago. I knew it was a long time rowing there in the cold and worrying. But it was short, too, because as soon as I did get on the other side, the big-eyed, brown-skinned girl would be gone. Well, pretty soon I saw a tall light, and I remembered the old lady had told me about looking for that light and rowing to it. I did, and when I got up to it, 2 men reached down and grabbed her. I started trembling all over again and praying. Then one of the men took my arm, and I just felt down inside of me that the Lord had got ready for me. "You hungry, boy?" is what he asked me. And if he hadn't been holding me, I think I would have fell backward into the river. And Gragston concludes, "That was my first trip. It took me a long time to get over my scared feeling, but I finally did. And I soon found myself going back across the river with 2 or 3 people, and sometimes a whole boatload. I got so I used to make 3 or 4 trips a month. Now, what did my passengers look like? I can't tell you any more about it than you can, and you wasn't there. After that first girl, no, I never did see her again. I never saw any passengers. I would have to be the black nights of the moon when I would carry them, and I would meet them out in the open or in a house without a single light. Even after freedom, decades after the Civil War was ended, apparently our conductor, Arnold Gragston, still fears the possible consequences of having broken the fugitive slave law, and does not want to admit he knew which neighbors he helped escape to freedom. Now Gragston speculates, "I guess you should wonder what I did with them after I got them over the river. Well, there in Ripley was a man named Mr. Rankins. I think the rest of his name was John. Mr. Rankins had a regular station for the slaves. He had a big lighthouse in his yard, about 30 feet high, and he kept it burning all night. It always meant freedom for his slave if he could get to this light. Sometimes Mr. Rankins would have 20 or 30 slaves that had run away on his place at a time. It must have cost him a whole lot to keep and feed them, but I think some of his friends helped him." And Gragston explains, "You see, Ohio was a free state, and once I got over the river from Kentucky or Virginia, Mr. Rankins would strut them all around town, and nobody would bother them. The only reason we used to land them quietly at night was that whoever brought them could go back for more, and because we had to be careful that none of the owners had followed us. Every once in a while they would follow in a boat and catch their slaves back. And sometimes they would shoot at whoever was trying to save the poor devils. Those who wanted to stay around that part of Ohio could stay, but didn't many of them do it, because there was just too much danger that you would be walking along free one night, feel a hand over your mouth, and be back across the river and in slavery again in the morning. Nobody in the world ever got a chance to know as much misery as a slave who had escaped and then been caught. So a whole lot of them went on north to other parts of Ohio, or to New York, or Chicago, or Canada. Canada was popular because all the slaves thought it was the last gate before you could get all the way inside of heaven. Now, I don't think there was much chance for a slave to make a living in Canada, but didn't many of them come back? They seemed like they'd rather starve up there in the cold than to be back in slavery. Now, during the Civil War, the Union Army started taking a whole lot of them, too. They would enlist and get good wages, more food than they ever had, and have all the little gals waving at them when they passed. Them blue uniforms was a nice change, too." Gragston remembers, "No, I never got anything from a single one of the people I carried over the river to freedom. I didn't want anything. After I'd made a few trips, I got to like it. And even though I could have been free any night myself, I figured I wasn't getting along so bad, so I would stay on Mr. Tabb's place and help the others get free. I did it for 4 years. And Gragston wonders, "I don't know to this day how Mr. Tabb never knew what I was doing. I used to take some awful chances, and he knew I must have been up to something. I wouldn't get much work done in the day, and never been in my house at night, and when he would happen to visit the plantation where I said I was going, and I wouldn't be there. Sometimes I think he didn't know and wanted me to get the slaves away that way so he wouldn't have to cause hard feelings by freeing himself." Now, I think Mr. Tabb used to talk a lot to Mr. John Fee. Mr. Fee was a man who lived in Kentucky. But Lord, how that man hated slavery. He always used to tell us, and we never let our owners see us listening to him though, that God didn't intend for some men to be free and some men to be in slavery. He used to talk to the owners too, when they would listen to him, but mostly they hated the sight of John Fee. This quote is from Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech, delivered when he was nominated by the Republican Party to run for president. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, or its advocates will push it forward, till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Gragston remembers. In the night, though, he was a different man. For every slave who came through his place across the river, he had a good word. Something to eat and some kind of rags, too, if it was cold. He always knew just what to tell you to do if anything went wrong. And sometimes I think he kept slaves there on his place till they could be rowed across the river. Helped us a lot. And finally, Arnold Gragston seeks freedom in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. Gragston remembers. I almost ran the business in the ground after I'd been carrying the slaves across for nearly 4 years. It was 1863, and one night I carried about 12 over on the same night. Somebody must have seen us, because they set out after me as soon as I steered out of the boat back on the Kentucky side. From that time on, they were after me. Sometimes they would almost catch me. I had to run away from Mr. Tabb's plantation and live in the fields and in the woods. I didn't know what a bed was from one week to another. I would sleep in a cornfield tonight, up in the branches of a tree tomorrow night, and buried in a hay pile the next night. The river where I'd carried across so many myself was no good to me. It was watched too close. Finally, I saw that I could never do any more good in Mason County, so I decided to take my freedom too. I had a wife by this time, and one night we quietly slipped across and headed for Mr. Ranking's Bill and Light. It looked like we had to go almost to China to get across that river. I could hear the bell and see the light on Mr. Ranking's place. But the harder I rode, the farther away it got, and I knew if I didn't make it, I'd get killed. But finally I pulled up by the lighthouse and went on to my freedom, just a few months before all the slaves got theirs. I went on to Detroit and still live there with most of my 10 children and 31 grandchildren. After the hard-fought Union victory at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which proclaimed that if the Confederacy surrendered by January 1st, 1863, she should keep her slaves. But if the rebellion persisted after that date, all slaves in the rebelling states would be free. This meant that slaves would flee to Union lines when the conflict approached their homes, and greatly increase the number of runaway slaves in the border states such as Kentucky. In another slave narrative, the mother of Augustine Tolton, the first admitted ex-slave to be ordained a Catholic priest, fled from the border state of Missouri to freedom during the Civil War. Slave catchers shot at the family as his mother rowed a boat across the Mississippi River to the free state of Illinois. In another story, Booker T. Washington and his mother were enslaved deeper in the South. He describes everyone's reactions when the master informed his slaves that they were now free since the Union had won the war. Arnold Gragston remembers, smiling. The bigger ones don't care so much about hearing it now, but the little ones never get tired of hearing how their grandpa brought emancipation to loads of slaves he could touch and feel, but could never see. Now, why didn't Arnold Gragston visit his old master if the Civil War had ended? Years after emancipation, Frederick Douglass's old master asked him to call on him. His old master told him when he read in his books how his mother was being mistreated by a relative, he made sure that she was taken care of better. Now, in our first videos in our series of slave narratives, Harriet Jacobs sailed for freedom after hiding for many years on our plantation. We read of Eliza Harris, who escaped with her infant daughter, crawling from one block of ice to another on a frozen river, inspiring a scene in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel that helped spark the Civil War. Harriet Tubman was perhaps the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She returned to Maryland 19 times to lead family members and other slaves to freedom, and even assisted in a military raid in South Carolina during the Civil War. And we reflect on the amusing story of Henry Box Brown, who had himself boxed up and shipped to freedom in Philadelphia. Now I will discuss the sources we used for this video. This verbatim interview with the 97-year-old ex-slave Arnold Gragston was the only account from our collection of slave narratives of the Underground Railroad that drew from the interviews conducted by the Federal Writers Project from 1936 to 1938. During the Depression, the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, hired painters to paint murals in post offices and other public buildings, and hired writers to record interviews of impoverished blacks and other poor people. And these interviews are on the internet. Would Arnold Gragston have been successful as a slave conductor if he had lived in Virginia, near the coast, where slavery was stronger? In Kentucky and the border states, the farms were smaller. There were no vast plantations with 100 or more slaves. And quite likely Kentuckians were more ambivalent about slavery than were Virginians. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.